Our scripture reading today comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 14, verses 22 through 29. Hear the word of the Lord. Be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is so far away, then exchange your tithe for silver and take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. And then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now is the time of the worship service when we receive your offerings and your tithes. It's very simple to make an offering. Simply go to the madeirachurch.org website and click on the online giving button. Your offerings help us continue to offer this online ministry and also help us to reach out and minister to people here in our community. Thank you in advance for your generous support.
I came into your presence a while ago, getting closer to you through quietness. I'm so fulfilled when I'm with you. I'm overcome by your magnificence.
You reached for me, I felt your call. I answered with a simple, here I am. And I became your messenger. I was unsure, but you said, yes, you can.
Simply want more of you.
I've learned a lot about being a blessing to other people through my family. My grandparents, my parents, my brother, my sister, my aunts and uncles, all of them have provided me with great examples and instruction on what it means to be a blessing to other people. However, this sermon being for Mother's Day, let me focus on Mom and how she has been an example to me in learning how to bless other people. Mom has always had a gift of hospitality and welcoming people. We've always had people outside our family home who came to our Thanksgiving and Christmas table, especially Avril Steinert, who was the kind elderly woman who was my childhood babysitter. She didn't have any family of her own, and so Mom made sure that she was a fixture at the Smith holiday table. That's just the kind of things that Mom did, and she would oftentimes be bringing in all kinds of different people to shower them with hospitality and kindness and love. But my favorite story of Mom's hospitality has got to be the story of Goots and Eddie. Now, we were vacationing at Litchfield Beach, South Carolina. And this was when I was a young child. I think I was 6 or 7 years old. And at that time, Litchfield Beach was a sleepy little family beach, very little development. I was very young, and Mom had taken me with her on the grocery run for the week. And the only grocery for an hour, within an hour's drive of where we were staying, was a small little IGA food liner. And we went in, we got our groceries. Just as we were getting ready to leave the store, a torrential rainstorm came through. And there we were, waiting under the awning, waiting for the rain to let up. And there with us were 2 young, scruffy-looking cyclists. And Mom, being the natural extrovert that she is, struck up a conversation. We soon discovered that these 2 cyclists, named Goots and Eddie, were German adventurers, and they were on a quest to cycle their way around the world. Like I said, they looked scruffy. If you took a look at them, you would have been suspicious and wondering, are these guys up to no good? But Mom took compassion on them because here they were cycling, staying in state parks, and trying to ration out every coin that they had. So Mom invited them to come and stay at our house. And as we were getting in the car to head back to the house to prepare everyone for the imminent arrival of our German cyclists, Mom says that I looked at her and I said, "Dad's not going to like this." And boy, was I right. Dad did not like it. He immediately, being the protective father, worried about who are these strangers. We don't know anything about them. They could be murderers. They could rob us. They could, all the full-on protection mode that you would expect Dad to go into. But soon Goots and Eddie showed up, and after some cautious conversation and prodding, and we had them there for dinner, and one day quickly turned into 3 or 4 days. And we gave them a bed and a place to stay and let them have showers, fed them for several days, and just had a grand and wonderful time. And the funny thing was that we soon found out that Goots and Eddie had been warned as they were cycling their way through the South. They had been warned, watch out for those rednecks. And so they asked us, are you those rednecks that they warned us about? Because they had been warned that you're 2 young guys, you're on the road, you don't have any, you're going through some backcountry areas, you could be in danger. So it was funny that we had been worried that they could be a danger. They had been worried, well, who are these strange people? Could they be these rednecks that we had been warned about? And then it was a wonderful few days. We enjoyed friendship and hospitality, and we kept getting updates from them all on their journey through Mexico, through Latin America, through down into South America, and they would continue to express gratitude for Mom's hospitality. And I can't help but think about that story anytime I come across all of these biblical admonitions to extend hospitality to strangers in the land. And when I read the laws commanding Israel to care for the stranger in the land, the foreigner, the migrant, the refugee, however you want to slice and dice, the stranger in the land, the person who's not one of your people who is in your land. The Bible repeatedly commends care for the stranger in the land as one of three vulnerable populations that the Bible frequently talks about: the stranger in the land, the widow, and the orphan. These were populations of people who were vulnerable, and it's understandable in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the extended family was the main social safety net. And it was the most important social safety net. So the ancient Israelite social system was built around the household that was much more expansive than what we would have in our common nuclear family today. And this household consisted of several generations of kinfolks and aunts and uncles, grandparents, also retainers and workers that attached themselves to the household and became a part of the extended family of the household. And so widows, orphans, and strangers in the land were vulnerable because they were people without that extended network. Unless they somehow attached on to a network of a household, they were very vulnerable. And they could easily be preyed upon by people of bad intent. And therefore, Israel was continually being instructed to extend special care to these most vulnerable people. And today's main passage that we're talking about, this passage from Deuteronomy, is an example of how Israel systematized that care through their religious structure. So a little background first. The book of Deuteronomy is one of the 5 books of Moses. It's a book of laws and statutes. It's structured around 3 speeches that Moses gives to prepare the Israelites to end their generation of wandering in the wilderness and enter into the promised land. So there's all that stuff that talks about if the place where God chooses to set up his name is far away, and it's got all these stipulations. That's because the temple hasn't been constructed yet, and it's just creating this awareness. You're going into the land, you're going to be setting up some religious observance in the land as preparing Israel for all of that. Some of the other things that Deuteronomy centers on are ethics, morality. How do you interact with the people in the land? How do you maintain faithfulness to God when you're being tempted to chase away after other religions? Deuteronomy is one of the books where we find a list of the 10 Commandments. So that's it's a lot of practical instruction. And then there is some stuff that's kind of puzzling in there that's peculiar to the ancient Near East. We're not going to get into much of that. But true to form, Deuteronomy commends care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in the land, the migrant, the refugee, the person from outside of your people group who has come in to be among you. And we see that right at the very end of the passage. But the beginning of the passage builds up to that by beginning with tithing. Now, this is puzzling, this is interesting, and I promise you this is not going to be a sermon in which I'm going to try to guilt you into giving to the church. And I know that pastors have way too much of a reputation for always asking for money, and anytime they see the word tithe, they shake their finger at you and say, this is why you should give to the church. But I think there are some basic principles at play here that need to be explained from the Bible, because this understanding of tithing helps us understand the ancient Israelite understanding of care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger in the land. So, of course, your household was expected to be caring for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in the land. You were expected to extend hospitality to people that wash up on your doorstep, the people that God drops in front of you, people in your circles, the people that you run across. But we also see here in Deuteronomy a way of systematizing that as a way of creating a safety net, so that there are many ways that these people on the fringes, these people who are vulnerable, can get help. And part of that is the principle of tithing. Now, what is tithing? There in verse 22, be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Tithe simply means tenth. And the Bible talks an awful lot about giving a tenth of what you have. So we see in Genesis 14, Abraham celebrates his victory over the kings who kidnapped his nephew by offering a tenth of all he had to Melchizedek, who was the priest of the Most High God at Salem. In Genesis 28, Jacob has his prophetic dream of the ladder stretching up to heaven, and when he wakes up, he vows to give a tenth of all that he has to God. And as we dig into the law, we find a number of references to different types of tithes. And scholars will talk about many different types of tithes: a first tithe, a second tithe, a poor tithe, etc. And it's really easy to get lost in the weeds on the details, but here is the general principle. I want you to understand the tithe principle. We can slice and dice this any different ways. And of course, people can start asking questions, well, am I supposed to tithe on my before tax or after tax income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those are all interesting questions, but the basic principle to steer us is this: set aside 1/10, a tithe, of your household's economic productivity and offer that tenth to God for ministry purposes. Set aside a tenth of your economic productivity, and offer it to God for ministry purposes. That is the basic principle behind tithing. Again, we can slice and dice the details all day long, but let's just focus on the big principle. It does feel like a big ask, a tenth, and yet it is achievable. It is doable. It is enough to stretch us, enough to make us feel a little uncomfortable, but it's not enough to break us. If we manage our finances well, and it will push us to, it's not enough to break us. It is enough to remind us that 100% of our household's economic productivity comes from the Lord in the first place. When you are giving 10% away, you are reminded again and again, it is the Lord who provides. And the Lord who provides in ordinary ways, but also sometimes in extraordinary ways. And people who give a tenth, and again, I'm going to suggest that this is for ministry purposes. Yes, you should give to your church, but there are other ministry purposes you can give to as well. Lots of ministry organizations want you to support your church, but you support other ministry organizations as well. When you are giving 10% away, then you are stretching yourself, and you will recognize all that I have. The 100% of what I've been given is a gift to me from God. One of my favorite movies is the movie Far and Away. It's a story of two Irish immigrants, Shannon and Joseph. They come to America to seek their fortune. When they land in Boston, all their money gets stolen, and they're soon befriended by the neighborhood boss of the Boston Irish ghetto. And he arranges room, board, employment. He makes all these arrangements, gets them set up. And after some months, Shannon and Joseph have built a good life, they've made friends, and they've saved up a lot of money for their eventual trip out west because they're going to seek land. But then they fall afoul of the local boss, and he and his henchmen burst into their apartment at night. They throw them out, and as Shannon reaches for the tin cup in which she had kept all her savings, the boss yanks it away from her and says, "There's not a penny there that didn't start with me. There's not a penny there that didn't start with me." Those words could easily have been said to any of us by God. There's not a penny that we have that didn't start with God. But rather than tossing us out into the cold, God gives us more than the material blessings. He gave his son to die that we might live. Christ gave his life so that we could discover spiritual riches far more valuable than material riches. And so when we tithe and we're recognizing all our material goods come from God, but we also are pushed to realize that we have received so much more. We have received new life and spiritual vitality, forgiveness, and a new spirit and a new heart through the grace and the mercy of Jesus Christ. Magnus McFarland, who is the founder of a Catholic charitable organization called Mary's Meals, they provide school lunches to kids all over the world. he recently came out with a book called Give, Charity and the Art of Living Generously. And he really grasps this mindset of recognizing that we have received everything and that that in itself transforms everything in our thinking. He says this, it's a little bit longer of a quote, but listen to this. The gift of the cross, he says, if we accept that we have been given it, creates a new starting point for our charity. If we can recognize that in order to give, we must first receive, we can see here that we have been given something beyond measure. If we believe and accept the gift, and accept too that everything we ever have or be is a gift, we will have received something that can fuel our giving for a lifetime and more. The more we develop a disposition that treats everything as a gift, the more instinctive and innate our charity becomes. We will feel compelled to share things that were never ours to keep. When we grasp that everything is a gift, and tithing pushes us to grasp that, when we grasp everything we have is a gift, we can give all the more generously. And that leads us into our second principle, because tithing helps us grasp materially, but as McFarland says, there's this spiritual gift that we have received. And our tithing, if the first principle of tithing is to give a tenth of our household's economic productivity going to ministry, the second principle is that giving is done in the context of celebratory worship. Giving is done in the context of recognizing that everything we have is from a loving God who gives us so much more, who gives us life and faith, and who gives us forgiveness and redemption and wholeness. So there in the next verses we see, eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. And so a part of the tithing in the ancient world was a celebratory worship meal. As you gathered all your stuff and traveled to Jerusalem. They didn't know it at the time that Deuteronomy was being compiled, but later, when God would set up his temple in Jerusalem, and there would be a worship, and there would be a temple there, and part of the sacrificial feasts and the celebrations and the festivals was to enjoy a fellowship meal with the Lord in the presence of the Lord. This would be a highlight of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem during the festivals. And so the idea here is that the bringing of your tithes and the giving of your tithes was not meant to be dour. It wasn't meant to be some kind of drudgery, not some kind of tax that is levied upon you that you give grudgingly, but rather that you bring your tithe in and you celebrate because you're enjoying sweet, rich fellowship with the living God who loves you and has given you everything that you have. And so it's built in, this celebratory aspect is built into this passage that we see, and it's built into the festivals of ancient Israel. And a grateful recognition of God's goodness to us, a grateful recognition of this loving relationship that we had. Years ago, I did a pulpit exchange with a local African-American congregation in the west end of Cincinnati. And what fascinated me about the church was the way they took up the offerings. Well, there were a lot of things that fascinated me about this church. It was a wonderful experience. But the way they took up the offerings it instructed me so much. The worship leader shouted out at the beginning of the offerings, and there were two offerings in this church, by the way, a church offering and a missions offering. And the worship leader shouted out, "It's offering time!" And then the people all shouted back together, "It's blessing time!" It's offering time, it's blessing time. And then the band kicked in to a rousing song, and the people danced down the aisles, and they placed their offerings in the baskets. The giving was done with celebration and with recognition that it is God who has blessed us with everything that we have. And out of that abundance, we joyfully offer back. Now, don't get this backwards. The wealth and prosperity gospel gets this backwards, and the wealth and prosperity gospel says, well, if you give, then God will bless you and guarantee that God will bless you. And by the way, give to my ministry, the wealth and prosperity gospel will say. No. That's not the way it works. We have already been blessed. We have been blessed with everything. And so we return our tithes to the Lord as a joyful thanksgiving for the blessing that we have received and the blessing of sweet, rich fellowship. So we have this tithe principle of a tenth of our household's economic productivity going for ministry purposes. And we have the second principle that giving is done in the context of celebratory worship. And then there's that part of the passage that talks about if the place the Lord has chosen to set his name is far away. And again, all of that is just provisions to make it easy to make it to Jerusalem to worship. But then we finally get the kicker. And this is where it brings in the care for the vulnerable. And it brings in this. A big chunk of the tithe is to go directly to care for people on the fringes. Verses 28 and 29. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So we get first this care for the Levites. And again, if you're a little fuzzy on who the Levites were, they weren't so much people on the fringes, they were the official religious establishment. So the 12 tribes of Israel, the whole tribe of Levi, was given as religious professionals. God did not declare them to have any inheritance of land. He said that they are going to serve me directly. And they're the ones that take care of the temple, and they take care of all the worship instruments. Before the temple, they took care of the tabernacle, and they take care of all the worship instruments. And they did other things too. They did all the ritual examinations of people, and some of that also involved taking care of people's health and providing rudimentary health care. Some of that also provided some counseling services, those kinds of things. And of course, they would distribute charitable resources to people in need. They would do religious instruction. They did all kinds of stuff. They were the official religious establishment of ancient Israel. And so here we see that since they do not have land, they've not been given land or an allotment, they are provided for in ancient Israel. But then you have the other three categories of those people who are on the fringes: the widows, the orphans, the strangers in the land. And here, the tithes of every third year set aside to provide for the Levites, but also to completely provide for the widows, the orphans, the strangers in the land, the vulnerable. They are cared for. A big chunk of these tithes are set aside not for administration purposes. That's, some of the other years we'll do some of the administration, but set aside to be a blessing for those who are most vulnerable. And so the Levites administered this religious social safety net to people on the fringes. And people were, of course, expected to give their personal time and talent and energy to minister to these folks. But we also had this official religious way of taking care of these folks. So, of course, these are the kinds of things the church does today. We provide this kind of care, both personally. You find somebody, you see a need, you meet a need. You have a widow who's off by herself, and you invite her to your Christmas table, and you extend care to her and take care of her. You look for these people on the fringes, and you provide care. But then we also have official religious organizations, whether through your church's deacons ministry, the church's deacons ministry, or our mission or committee supports other Christian agencies that specialize in these kinds of things in the community. Organizations like the City Gospel Mission, the Interparish Ministry, Master's Provisions, Needs, etc., etc., etc. These kinds of organizations and these programs. So we support those things through our gifts and our tithes and as they come in, and we also do it personally. You see how it goes hand in glove. Now, here is how this all fits together, because it's not just about tithing as funding all these good things, though it does fund all these good things. But remember that piece about it being done in the context of joyful worship and the recognition that everything we have received is gift from God. Now, when we give and when we care for people on the fringes, when we care for people who are vulnerable, it's easy to do it out of a wrong mindset. We could care for a vulnerable person out of a sense of guilt. Well, I know I'm supposed to do this. Or we could do it out of a sense of benign condescension. Well, they've really messed their lives up, but I've got my life together. I can help take care of them. A kind of a noblesse oblige. We could do it to make ourselves feel better. Well, I just feel so good helping this person because, they're really hurting, and it just makes me, it warms my heart to be able to do something for them. We could have any of these kinds of motivations. But the passage teaches us that we give, we help the vulnerable out of a mindset that is, we have received much. That we don't have anything. It's God's ministry. We are just the conduit through which it goes. See, we are beggars just as much as anyone else. We, being made in the divine image of God, God bestows blessing upon us, and we see other divine image bearers, and we are a conduit of God's blessing unto them. These practices of tithing and of giving in the context of joyful worship, they shape our hearts to recognize, yes, everything I have has come from the Lord, and I've received so much, and therefore it overflows out from me. The joy and the gratitude overflows out from me to others. And that is the mindset that we're trying to develop in our giving. We're overflowing the joy of the Lord from us to those who are most vulnerable and in need. That overflow transforms how we see those folks on the fringes. The overflow transforms how we view the vulnerable folks. They're not problems to be fixed. They're divine image bearers to be loved. They're not irritations that have to be cleaned up. They are unique creations of God. They're not objects upon whom we dispense our charity. They are people with voices who can make a distinctive contribution in the world. You see how it transforms things when we recognize everything we have as gift to us. We don't look at people as objects of charity. We look at them as other people who are receiving God's gift. So back to Cincinnati. Mom has always seen herself as being very blessed. And I know that when she offered to Cincinnati to come and stay with us, she wasn't thinking of this as some charitable thing, some project. She wasn't adopting them in as some project to be fixed. She didn't think of it as some kind of way of fulfilling herself out of being nice and good. She was just giving because she had received so much. She was giving because she loved. She was giving out of her abundance and her sense of blessings, and it was just overflowed naturally to invite these fellows because they looked kind of interesting, and they seemed like they were needing some help at the time. She gave out of a sense of fullness that everything she had been given to her by the Lord. And out of that giving of fullness, we discovered new friends, new divine image bearers, new friends who enriched our lives. So my challenge to you is this. As you practice the discipline of tithing, practice it as a way of reminding yourself that everything you have comes from God. As you practice the discipline of joyful worship, practice it as a way of reminding yourself of God's blessing and God's favor extended to you. And may those practices so shape your heart that when you begin to see people on the fringes, you begin to see people who are vulnerable in a whole new way. May you perceive in them the divine image that God has bestowed on them. And may you perceive in the vulnerable people and the people on the fringes that God has dropped into your life, may you perceive the unique opportunities that God gives you to overflow his love into their lives and to be his instrument of blessing to them. So, brothers and sisters, you think about that. Amen. Go in grace, go in mercy, go in peace. May the living Lord Jesus Christ go with you. May he go above you to watch over you, behind you to encourage you, beside you to befriend you, within you to give you peace, and before you to show you the way, both now and forevermore.